Trying to call this meeting to order. Do I have unanimous consent to call the meeting to order?
Yes.
Do I have
Let's hear opening statement.
Yes, so if I have unanimous consent to start the meeting, we can get our witnesses on the record with their testimony that we are anxious to hear, and I will suspend the meeting within a couple of minutes prior to the next vote happening. Everybody's okay with that? All right, okay. Yes, sir.
I think since the bell is ringing, some of our members still in the House wishing to vote in the House.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
A few of my colleagues are probably still in the House since the bell has rang and preparing to do
Yes, but we have unanimous consent to be able to start the meeting so that the witnesses can give us testimony.
Okay.
And I believe that we're within the clearance to be able to do that. We have quorum, so we can do that. All right, okay, I've called the meeting to order, meeting 111 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. A message to avoiding audio feedback. Before we begin, I need to ask all members and others in-person participants to consult the cards on the table, little round circles that you see there, in order to prevent feedback incidents for our translators. So keep your earpiece away from your microphones at all time. And when you're not using your earpiece, please face it down on the sticker placed on the table. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. We have several people online here. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, use your raise hand function, and the comments go through the chair. Any technical issues arise, please let us know, and we will suspend immediately in order to ensure translation is there. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, October 17th, 2023, the committee is resuming its study of the 2026 CUSMA review. And with us today, we have Anna Zelic, Professor, Environmental and Urban Change, York University by video conference, and Meredith Lilly, Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy, Carleton University. From the Canadian Cattle Association, Dennis Laycraft, Executive Vice President, Jack Schaff, Officer at Large. Council of Canadians, Nicholas Barry Shaw, Trade and Privatization Campaigner by video conference. From the Fisheries Council of Canada, Paul Landsbergen, President. And from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Sean Heather, Senior Vice President, International Regulatory Affairs and Antitrust. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. Apologies for the late start, but I think you've all been here enough to know how it all works. So we'll start with opening remarks with Dr. Zelic, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to the chair and the committee for the invitation to present insights here, and to Clerk Sophia Nicol for her assistance in making this possible. Over the past 20 years, my research has concerned the geopolitics of the oil industry, and I've conducted extensive field work in oil-producing regions in Mexico, among other regions, and Nigeria, and I have also researched oil and gas regulation in Canada, as well as the role of Canadian extractive firms at the UN agency responsible for managing deep-sea mining in the seabed outside state jurisdiction, the International Seabed Authority. Recently, a significant portion of my work has concerned Canadian investment in the restructured Mexican energy sector brought about by Mexico's controversial 2013 energy reform. At present, I speak to you from Mexico City, where we just completed the Mexican leg of a binational intensive field course on the CUSMA. And the second and final week of this course will continue at York University in the last week in June. I would note that Canada's renewed and sudden visa restrictions on Mexico at the end of February created a significant and unexpected logistical problem for us in planning the course, and I would underline that policy change as an irritant in ongoing relations between the two countries. So since the implementation of the Mexican energy reform and over the past decade, the continental energy relationship has transformed, particularly as United States, which had previously been a net importer of fossil fuels, including from Canada and Mexico, became a net global exporter, and this in particular of natural gas from its fracking boom to the Mexican energy grid. Although this predated COVID, this exhibits so-called nearshoring, which in the pandemic's aftermath is often invoked as a means to prevent supply chain blockages through physical and often terrestrial proximity. But the result here has involved a reversal in Mexican energy sovereignty in a form similar to the reversal in Mexican food sovereignty that resulted from the NAFTA Accord, after which Mexico shifted from being a net exporter to a net importer of corn. So the same has occurred now with relationship to Mexico's hydrocarbon supply. Now, the gas that is delivered to Mexico comes via a pipeline system in which Export Development Canada has been a significant investor, and this particularly given the role of TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Pipelines, as a major Canadian investor in Mexico. Indeed, in recent years, TC Energy has touted itself as the single largest Canadian investor in Mexico. TC Energy's major role in the distribution of gas across the continent has come at a considerable cost to not only Mexican energy sovereignty, but to broader civil society's role across North America in meaningful climate policy. And this is seen, for instance, in TC Energy's controversial ISDS case against the U.S. government for the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline expansion. That climate change and Indigenous rights receive limited substantive treatment in CUSMA is a significant area for consideration in the review, as is the need to take advantage of the best aspects of CUSMA to develop a continental climate plan for a collectively managed transition off of fossil fuels. The lack of language or an annex on climate agreements makes all three states in the agreement vulnerable to claims if they seek to alter their domestic policies to reduce overall carbon emissions. For Mexico, this is particularly acute given annexes and articles that prevent Mexico from reforming particular elements in its electricity sector, and these tensions are seen in the tabling of complaints by both Canada and the U.S. in the last couple of years with relation to the role of bodies such as Mexico's Federal Electricity Commission and PEMEX. So a proper plan for continental energy transition would require independent, ongoing modeling and research that would entail an analysis of the life cycle emissions and hazards posted by various energy sources, including from the process of extracting and continentally transporting fracked gas. And this would require substantively and enforceably raising rather than lowering the bar that made accidents such as that in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec possible. This would also require the end of the threat of ISDS on Mexico should it wish to modify contracts or promote its own energy sources, because at the present, Mexico is at risk of these being interpreted as negatively impacting private Canadian and U.S. firms. And a proposal to this effect, I noted, is included in the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives' recent publication on the CUSMA review, which calls for a moratorium on trade and investment rules that would challenge climate change policies. It also calls for a rapid response environmental enforcement tool similar to the successful rapid response labor mechanism, which we discussed in significant detail in this course in Mexico City over the past week. So I would note here that CUSMA can be updated to strengthen continental leadership, not only in labor rights, as the CUSMA agreement does and stands out internationally, but also in environmental and social policy, thus in Indigenous rights, climate commitments, and notably on the protection of migrants. In US, Canada, and Mexico, creating a level playing field in labor protections by raising them, and in the enforcement of global norms around upholding Indigenous rights and substantive emissions reductions, as well as investigating gender-based violence in the context of domestic work, would be essential elements in confronting key contemporary global challenges. So I guess I would just end by noting that expanding the existing rapid response mechanism for labor violations to agriculture and migrant labor, as well as adopting a similar kind of mechanism for both disputes around environmental conditions so that they would be handled in an effective and efficient form, and disputes over Indigenous rights and human rights more broadly, would create the basis for all three parties complying potentially with their requirements under the IPCC and the Paris Agreement. I thank you very much for your time and consideration. I'm happy to discuss these comments further.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zelic. Dr. Lilly, please.
Thank you, Chair Sgro and committee members, for the invitation to be here today. I teach North American trade relations, and this is also my primary area of research. I participate in a number of trilateral initiatives focused on North American trade, including those led by U.S. and Mexican partners. I write extensively on the implementation of CUSMA, and I'm completing a report now on the upcoming review that I'd be pleased to share with the committee. So I'm really pleased that the committee has established this study, and I hope it marks the beginning of sustained parliamentary focus on this important file. Canada's objective for the 2026 review should be the extension of CUSMA by all three countries. Realistically, this is going to be challenging, but it should be our goal nonetheless. In order to be successful, it is incumbent on Canada to prepare extensively over the next year. I want to underscore the urgency because July 1, 2026 represents the cleanest opportunity to reach trilateral agreement to extend the agreement for 16 more years. If that doesn't occur, then a joint review takes place, and these reviews continue annually until all three countries agree to extend the agreement, or it eventually terminates in 2036. Clearly, the latter scenario of annual reviews would be destabilizing for business and would undermine trade and investment certainty in North America. So today I'd like to focus my comments on three processes Canada should put in place now to secure the best possible outcome for our country in 2026. First, the proactive engagement by this committee to launch this CUSMA study must be paralleled at the officials level. We need a named senior official at Global Affairs to lead Canada's activities, and this work should be their exclusive daily focus. Their team should launch broad consultations with Canadian stakeholders on the implementation of CUSMA, and they should work to develop solutions to the irritants they encounter before 2026. They should also work to develop proposals to address new shared trilateral challenges such as artificial intelligence, digital privacy, and the disruptive consequences for electric vehicle supply chains and national security. Canada can lead the development of proposals for adoption by CUSMA partners which focus on North American-made parts and production to reflect industry changes while satisfying the interests of all three countries. Canada can't wait for pressure from the U.S. to launch our own domestic CUSMA review process. Americans will be preoccupied this year with the U.S. presidential election. However, when the U.S. Congress does turn its attention to its own U.S. domestic review in 2025, it will be understandably focused on advancing U.S. interests. The best way for Canada to steer the 6-year review toward our desired outcomes, then, is to have developed our solutions by spring of 2025. Committee members should know that Mexico has already announced the launch of its own domestic consultations. Secondly, if the extension of CUSMA in 2026 is Canada's goal, then we have to demonstrate that it's working well now, which for the most part it is. In addition, we must demonstrate that dispute settlement processes can be effective. This means encouraging all three countries to abide by rulings under the CUSMA process, even when our interests are not satisfied, such as on aspects of Canada's tariff rate quote allocation process for dairy. But implementing CUSMA in good faith also means not adopting legislation and regulatory measures that contravene CUSMA and antagonize the Americans. For example, on digital trade, the Online Streaming Act would be in violation of the digital chapter of CUSMA if it were not for Canada's cultural exemption. Similarly, unilateral action by Canada to introduce a digital services tax will discriminate against large U.S. firms. We should be prepared for U.S. retaliation if these measures are enacted, and Canadian lawmakers should be aware of the damaging consequences for the broader CUSMA review process. Third, as committee members know, China will be the elephant in the room leading up to and throughout the CUSMA review. In particular, new tariffs on Chinese EVs, steel and aluminum pronounced by President Biden will necessarily impact the integrated North American supply chain. This U.S. trade action will increase the likelihood of a surge in transshipment by China through Canada and Mexico, and it is vital that Canada not be regarded as a leaky entry point into U.S. markets. Just as Canada resolved to align with the U.S. on its Inflation Reduction Act incentives to encourage domestic battery and EV production, it now follows that Canada will need to address Chinese subsidies, overcapacity, and potential dumping on the Canadian market. Given current global dependence on Chinese critical minerals and processing capacity, Canada must weigh its options very carefully. Mexico faces its own challenges in this regard, particularly with respect to onshore Chinese investment. Nevertheless, since maintaining open tariff-free trade with the U.S. reflects Canada's most important economic interest, we must address this issue. I hope these 3 recommendations can help position Canada to achieve its ultimate objectives for a successful extension of CUSMA in 2026. Millions of Canadians rely on the agreement's success, and your committee is engaged in vital work. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lilly. Mr. Laycroft or Mr. Schaaf?
It's Jack Chafe. On behalf of the Canadian Cattle Association, CCA, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your committee on the CUSMA review today. My name is Jack Chafe, Officer at Large with CCA, and have a feedlot in southwestern Ontario where I farm with my family. Also joining me today is Dennis Laycraft, Executive Vice President of CCA, who also will be here to answer questions later. CCA represents 60,000 beef producers across Canada, from cow-calf farms and ranches through to feedlots. Our sector generates $21.8 billion to Canada's GDP annually, and trade is key to our economic success. Of our beef production, approximately half is exported to international trade and adds about 40% of the value to each animal. Looking at North America, U.S. is our largest trading partner, and Mexico is our 3rd largest, with following in behind Japan. Historically, CCA has been involved in the CUSMA negotiations and its predecessor, NAFTA, and its predecessor, the Canada-U.S. Trade Agreement. I mention this because historically, North America trade of live cattle and beef always has been our highest priority. Our exports, 85% is sent to the U.S. In 2023, the value of live cattle and beef exports to the U.S. and Mexico exceeded $6 billion. It is essential that all 3 governments look at the CUSMA review with a do-not-harm approach, focusing on the success for all 3 countries. CCA, together with our American and Mexican counterparts, hold 3 trilateral meetings annually, working together to strengthen the North American trade and combat global challenges. At our most recent meeting, we discussed the upcoming review. Our 3 national associations are united in ensuring a strong North American integrated beef supply chain, and at our upcoming meeting this summer in Saskatoon, we will be reviewing the CUSMA and coming out of there with a unified statement moving into the 26th review. The integration of the North American beef sector has demonstrated its resilience in challenges as working through the pandemic and during weather-related issues, and have come up with a strong integrated supply chain. As we discuss the 2026 CUSMA review today, I would be remiss if I did not mention the current challenges we are facing with the USA and their final ruling on voluntary product of U.S. labeling, which will also come into effect in 2026. CCA and the Government of Canada submitted extensive comments to the USDA expressing our concerns on this ruling, suggesting an alternative would be concise with international practices, which USDA is clearly not in this ruling. Further, U.S. is making a ruling mandatory for federal procurement requirements. CCA continues to work with AFC, Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Embassy in D.C. on this file, and are monitoring closely the segregation of cattle, which would impact beef producers on both sides of the border. We remain concerned that the ruling will lead to discrimination against live cattle imports and undermine the beneficial integration of the North American supply chain. In the context of today's study, it is key that your committee is aware of these trade tensions. We encourage the committee to take a Team Canada approach as we look at the 2026 CUSMA review. There is a lot at risk, and we emphasize the do not harm approach. We echo the national cattle feeders who were here at your committee last week in focusing on regulatory cooperation and ensuring trade clean measures, which would be the goal, rather than new tariffs and trade restrictions. As we've seen in the past, Our message is stronger when we work together with the federal and provincial governments and industry. On behalf of the Canadian beef farmers and ranchers, we will remain committed to working with you on the best trade outcome in 2026. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I need to check with the committee. There is 7 minutes left. If there are members that want to leave and go and vote in the House, I can suspend the meeting if that's the will of the committee. Does the committee want to continue on for another 5 minutes, then suspend? Or are those, if there's any members that want to be going to the House to vote, they can go now and I can suspend while they go. I'm sorry, Mr. Cannings, do you want, you're okay to vote here? You want, okay. Mr. Wilson, are you staying or you're going? So I'm going to suspend until the members have had an opportunity to vote and return back to the committee. My apologies for the delay. Mr. Barry Shaw, I invite you to speak to the committee for up to 5 minutes, please. Lost him. Okay, I'll go to Mr. Landsberg. Mr. Landsberg, up to 5 minutes, please. Oops, we got you back. Okay, thank you. My apologies. Please, Mr. Barry Shaw, up to 5 minutes.
Hi there. My name is Nick Barry Shaw. I'm the trade and privatization campaigner with the Council of Canadians, which is a grassroots membership-based organization comprised of 43 chapters across the country and uniting over 150,000 supporters from coast to coast to coast. I'm happy to be here to speak about the CUSMA review because, as some of you may know, the council was founded in 1985 in the crucible of debates around continental free trade, first with the United States and then with Mexico. And throughout our organization's history, we've campaigned against corporate trade deals like NAFTA that put profits before people and the planet. And so I guess the first thing I just wanted to remark on was that we're in a kind of strange moment where at the kind of political and media elite level, there is a very strong consensus in favor of continuing with these trade deals as is. And yet there is simultaneously a recognition that they've done a tremendous amount of harm to ordinary Canadians. So you have even diehard defenders of free trade like Andrew Coyne, who are basically forced to admit that the economic results of the last 30 years have been dismal. In a recent column, Coyne wrote that despite Canada's trade and broader economic policies being, quote, an example of everything that orthodox economics would recommend as recipes for prosperity, Canada's productivity has slumped and growth rates have fallen. How could this be, Coyne wrote? We did everything right. Now, the confusion that defenders of that orthodoxy feel, I think, was not something that afflicted the Council of Canadians or its allies in the fight against these free trade deals. When they were first being negotiated, we argued that they would decimate manufacturing employment and drive down workers' wages in Canada as corporations restructured production in search of the lowest costs. We argued that investor-state dispute mechanisms, like NAFTA's Chapter 11, would allow corporations to sue governments even if they were pursuing legitimate efforts to regulate business and protect the environment. And we argued that the pressure to attract increasingly footloose foreign investment through subsidies and corporate tax cuts would inevitably erode our fiscal base and therefore our public services, most notably our healthcare system. And so it gives me really no pleasure to note that these warnings from the Council of Canadians over the years about what free trade would bring to us are largely correct. Rather than a vigorous competitive economy, Canadians have an economic landscape dominated by oligopolies, the result of corporate consolidation on a continental scale. Rather than a rising tide that lifts all boats, Canadians have experienced stagnant wages, rising prices, and spiraling income and wealth inequality. The renegotiation of NAFTA into the Canada-US-Mexico agreement brought several welcome departures from this tired and discredited economic orthodoxy, notably the removal of Chapter 11 and the creation of the Rapid Response Mechanism to protect Mexican workers against violations of their right to form a union. The 2026 review of CUSMA is an opportunity to continue in this direction. And for that reason, the Council of Canadians wholeheartedly supports efforts to expand enforceable labor rights protections by widening the scope and applicability of the Rapid Response Mechanism to all workers in North America and to a broader list of labor rights violations. We also strongly believe that the last vestiges of NAFTA's Chapter 11, which live on in CUSMA's more limited Chapter 14, should be done away with, as should investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms in other treaties that continue to constrain legitimate efforts to take on climate change and to protect the environment. But it's not clear to us that it's possible to fully reverse engineer CUSMA into a trade and investment agreement that places workers' rights, climate action, and environmental protection ahead of corporate profits. Despite the removal of Chapter 11, CUSMA continues to hamper the Mexican government's efforts to reassert its energy and food sovereignty. Just to give one recent example, in February 2023, the Mexican government announced its intention to ban the pesticide glyphosate and phase out genetically modified corn. In response to outcry from U.S. agribusiness, the U.S. government initiated a trade challenge, not under Chapter 11 or Chapter 14, but under Chapter 31, citing violations of CUSMA's sanitary and phytosanitary standards. While the Mexican government has emphasized the need to protect indigenous varieties of maize from genetic contamination by GM corn, the U.S. has attempted to narrow the issue to whether GM corn is safe to consume, claiming that Mexico's phase-out is not, quote, science-based. And so the trouble with this regulatory standard that is in CUSMA, in addition to rejecting the precautionary principle and the wider concerns about food sovereignty that have motivated Mexico's decision, is that it ignores the enormous upstream efforts to warp the, quote, science deployed by agribusiness and other industries. As the Monsanto papers revealed, this went so far as to recruiting scientists to publish studies that ultimately defended the safety of their products, some of which were secretly reviewed by Monsanto prior to publication. And so this is an issue that the Council of Canadians, and especially its Northumberland chapter, has been paying a lot of attention to. And unfortunately, the Canadian government has sided with the U.S. in this dispute and also blocked the efforts of our Northumberland chapter to present arguments in favor of this phase-out. And so I guess I'll just close by saying that the scale of the problems we face, the climate crisis first and foremost, require a rethinking of the entire economic model that these deals were really meant to entrench. We need trade and investment agreements that will help rather than hinder the shift away from fossil fuels and the massive public investment in infrastructure and in green manufacturing that it requires. We need trade deals that will increase rather than erode workers' bargaining power. And we need trade deals that will facilitate the rebuilding of our public services that have been worn down by years of neglect.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barry Shaw. On to Mr. Landsbergen, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the invitation to testify today. Since it was only late last month that I testified before this committee, I will forego my usual introduction of FCC and the sector. The Canadian seafood sector accounts for $7.6 billion in exports to over 100 countries, and our southern neighbor is our largest market at $4.8 billion of our exports, more than triple the next market. Also noteworthy is that our seafood imports from the U.S. are $1.2 billion, leaving us with a trade surplus in seafood of $3.6 billion. Now, I'm pleased to say that our seafood exports to the U.S. are up 57% over the last decade. So it goes without saying that we value our trading relationship with the U.S. Our top export products to the U.S. are lobster at $1.6 billion, crab at $1.1 billion, salmon at $975 million, the latter being farmed, and then halibut and scallops are the distant third and fourth, both nearing $200 million, or fourth and fifth, sorry. The top import products are salmon at $415 million, lobster at $283 million, crab at $140 million, with scallops at $29 million and cod at $17 million, rounding out the top five. Fish and seafood had no tariffs under NAFTA, and that was maintained under CUSMA, and obviously we would want this to continue. The important thing to remember on this is that the U.S. is a net importer of fish and seafood to the tune of $20 billion annually. That represents 80% of their domestic market. This could motivate an administration to apply a tariff in the belief it could help the domestic industry. Former President Trump did do this with tariffs against Chinese imports. And seafood is the most globally traded food commodity. The global supply chain is complex, and products can be exported and re-exported before it reaches its final consumer. So the impacts of tariffs in the U.S. are equally complex. Suffice it to say, we prefer free trade. Of equal importance is how CUSMA protects us from non-tariff barriers. We don't want other government actions to disadvantage or prohibit our access to the U.S. market. Just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about restrictive import policies and whether they were creating undue barriers to Canadian exports of fish and seafood. Granted, there are some real challenges in the global industry that governments need to address individually and collectively, but it's important to do that in a way that does not unduly restrict trade. CUSMA has a dispute resolution mechanism, which is vitally important, and there are also mechanisms under WTO. But the challenge with these is that they are very time-consuming, and the offending measure is in place during the proceedings, meaning that the damage continues to being done. Reimbursement or retribution after the fact is sometimes cold comfort. Having said that, these provisions are like insurance. You hope you don't need it, but you don't want to get caught without it. The best way to deal with non-tariff barriers is to try to prevent them in the first place. In order to do that, we need to have a positive relationship built on constructive and regular dialogue. This needs to happen government to government, but also industry to industry. For example, DFO, Agriculture Canada, and CFIA are able to engage with their counterparts to discuss issues of mutual interest. In fact, NOAA has recently reached out to DFO to discuss their review of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, and Canada was the first it called for input. So this is helpful and a signal of a good relationship. On the industry side, FCC has a good relationship with our American counterparts, the National Fisheries Institute, and we compare notes on issues of mutual interest. The most recent examples are SIMP and some proposed EU regulations that could affect live lobster exports from both countries. We sought their views on the SIMP review, and we brought to their attention the proposed regulations on animal health transport. The relationship between the two countries is also supported by the fact that they provide secretariat services to the International Coalition of Fisheries Associations, and I am the current chair of the board. So we work closely on behalf of members of our international group, and our respective participation in international dialogues also enables more regular conversations about current events. To sum up, we need CUSMA as it provides important structure to our trading relationship, but we need to be engaged and present in regular dialogue. The Team Canada is an important step in lead up to the CUSMA review. And with that, I will thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Heather, please.
Madam Chair, on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and provide testimony to the Standing Committee as it evaluates actions ahead of the CUSMA review. The Chamber has a long-standing commitment to the North American economic relationship. No organization in the United States has been more vocal advocate for a strong and mutually beneficial partnership with Canada and Mexico. We are guided by principle, not politics. We defend and promote free enterprise, free markets, rules-based trade and investment, and the rule of law. The trilateral relationship goes beyond the impact of our $1.7 trillion annual three-way trade to include significant direct investment ties and highly integrated value chains that support millions of jobs across all three countries. Our three countries have the potential to expand the important relationship and work together to meet shared challenges, such as diversification of semiconductor production, energy security, energy transition, food security, and critical minerals. CUSMA is intended to facilitate closer economic cooperation and to provide legal certainty for cross-border trade and investment. The Chamber calls on each of the three governments to address implementation and compliance issues and uphold the spirit and letter of the agreement. In short, we each must keep our word. For example, the Chamber has called for the U.S. government to uphold the dispute settlement panel ruling automotive rules of origin published back in January of 2023. As we aim to make North America the most competitive global platform for vehicle production, the future of the continent's automotive industry depends on the certainty provided by this agreement. In addition, maintaining our competitive edge also means avoiding the expansion of U.S.-driven Buy American policies. In short, we need to recognize that in North America, we make things together. At the same time, we appreciate the opportunity to also highlight areas that require Canada to fulfill its CUSMA commitments. Canada is advancing an ambitious digital agenda. We are concerned that Canada is looking to bolster its competitiveness at times by targeting U.S. businesses. Such policies not only erode Canada's culture of innovation and competitiveness, but also undermine Canada's commitment to maintaining open and fair business climates. First, I'd like to flag our concern with the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunication Commission's decision to impose an initial based contribution of 5% on U.S. streaming services. This decision fails to recognize the investments made by American streaming services in Canada's creative sector. Indeed, Americans can hardly turn their televisions on without seeing programs created here in Canada. Consequently, Americans find it ironic that Bill C-11 specifically targets U.S. companies in a manner that may violate Canada's international trading obligations, including those under CUSMA. This action appears to contravene commitments that guarantee a minimal standard of treatment, require equal treatment of foreigners and local enterprises, and obligate Canada to refrain from imposing certain performance requirements to foreign direct investment. Second is our deep concern over the potential for Canada to reintroduce its unilateral digital services tax through implementing Bill C-59. The DST is set to introduce discriminatory measures against U.S. companies, violating Canada's obligations under CUSMA and the WTO, and contradicting Canada's commitment to the G20 OECD process. Adding to our concern is the fact that Canada's proposed DST is 2, potentially 3 years retroactive. We would note that the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative has investigated several substantially similar measures as those proposed by Canada, including a French DST in which the Canada version is modeled, and found them to be unreasonable or discriminatory, burdensome or restrictive of U.S. commerce, and thus actionable under U.S. trade law. Lastly, we have serious concerns with the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which is part of Bill C-27, currently being studied by your colleagues in the House of Commons Industry Committee. In its current draft, the bill is overly broad and restrictive, capturing a potentially endless number of low-risk use cases, which risk putting Canada out of step with the U.S. and other important trading partners on AI regulation. If it moves forward, we are concerned it will have an adverse effect on Canada's competitiveness, hinder AI development, limit business exploration, and ultimately affect productivity and economic growth. During our visit to Ottawa this week, we'll be hosting an AI policy dialogue precisely to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities related to AI. At the Chamber, we are focused on keeping the 2026 CUSMA review in perspective. While the 3 trading partners are sovereign states, no one has identified a compelling reason to undertake a wide-ranging renegotiation of this agreement. Primarily, this upcoming review is an opportunity to ensure implementation and compliance with the existing commitments. Having said that, the Canadian policies such as Bill C-11, the proposed DST, and Canada's approach to AI all have the potential to complicate this review. Perceptions that Canada is violating CUSMA commitments will serve to increase pressure to criticize the agreement during the review process. In closing, the Chamber stands ready to work with our partners in Canada to continue to build a strong North American partnership. We thank you for this opportunity to share our views at this hearing and look forward to your questions.
Very much, sir. Okay, we have approximately 20 minutes remaining. I'm suggesting we complete round 1 with 5 minutes each member. All right, Mr. Seeback, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Very interested to hear what Dr. Lilly and Mr. Heather just talked about on the trade irritants. So my concern as we look into this review, and I've called this in other committees, we're going through a series of what I call own goals in Canada that will potentially frustrate this review. And so I just want to ask both of you, Dr. Lilly and Mr. Heather, the Online Streaming Act, the DST, and C-27, if these all go and are implemented as it looks like the current government wants to, will this make the CUSMA review easier or more complicated in your view?
Thank you for the question. On the Online Streaming Act and the Digital Services Tax, if these move forward, I fully expect action to happen before the 2026 review. I think the Americans will respond. The 2 pieces are slightly different because the Online Streaming Act can trigger retaliation associated with the cultural exemption in a way that is different than the Digital Services Tax. And so we could expect retaliation on the Online Streaming Act any time after it actually comes into effect, whereas the Digital Streaming Act, if the Americans want to dispute that, they would have to take it to a Chapter 31 case. But both those things to say, I think that these will complicate the process and they will result in a full review if they aren't addressed before then.
Yeah. I would agree with Dr. Lilly that the likelihood that if these 3 things come into force, that there will be response by the United States, perhaps before the CUSMA review. That's not to suggest that that would be the end of it. So these things would certainly be a part of that review process and would be a weight towards moving that review process forward successfully.
Thanks very much. Dr. Lilly, you talked a little bit about anti-circumvention and anti-dumping with respect to what's going on with Chinese EVs and steel. we have a bad record under this government of responding to these issues. We were, sort of broadsided with 232 tariffs with aluminum and steel because we were viewed as the dumping ground for things down in the United States. The Canadian steel producers came before committee. They said the anti-circumvention legislation in place here in the system is not sufficient to deal with anti-circumvention. And they've been calling on the government to make changes to that to prevent exactly what happened with those 232 tariffs. Nothing has changed. So do you see that also as a problem as we head up to this review if something's not done to make sure we're not the dumping ground?
I think Canada is going to have to respond on the EV issue soon. Again, probably sooner than the CUSMA review. When it comes to circumvention and port inspections, Canada is not doing enough. And we can see that with things like the enforcement of elimination of forced labor from our supply chains. Certainly, there were concerns from the Americans during the NAFTA negotiations around transshipment of Chinese steel and aluminum through Canada. That's constantly, I think, on the radar of the Americans, and so it's something that we'll have to watch very, very carefully. And there will necessarily be increased pressure, both as the Americans move forward with their tariffs on Chinese EVs, but also as the EU moves ahead, and we expect details on that this week. Then any country that doesn't have similar measures in place is going to become a target. So yes, it's something we need to take very seriously and increase our enforcement around these issues.
It's just shocking to me why we're always so slow compared to other countries around the world to respond to these things. You did raise the issue of forced labor. We know that was actually part of the renewed CUSMA. And Canada also has an absolutely abysmal record of stopping the importation of goods made with forced labor, especially Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang. U.S. has an entities list. They've seized billions of dollars of goods. Canada's done absolutely nothing. We've seized nothing. Do you think that also could be an impediment? Canada's clear inability to even honor, under this current government, to honor our obligations under CUSMA on the forced labor issues?
I'm sorry, but I have to ask for a brief answer.
I think it's less of an issue for CUSMA. It could come up, but I actually just think it's Canada not doing the right thing, and we should take these responsibilities very seriously and these human rights violations very seriously.
Thank you. Mr. Sidhu, for 5 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for taking the time to be here today. My question is for Mr. Heather. As you know, trade within Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. supports millions of jobs in our respective countries. To my understanding, 49 U.S. states count Canada or Mexico as one of their top 3 merchandise export markets. Would you say there's widespread awareness in the United States, in municipalities and states, in terms of the economic value of trade and jobs impacted at the local level?
I would say that trade has never polled as a top political issue in our national politics. But I think every American values what trade has brought to their daily lives. So when you ask the question, which is, what level is the consciousness of trade in the average American, I think it's a difficult way to crystallize it, because in some ways it's not something that they think about when they go to the polls. But at the same time, Americans do very much value the products and services that are on American shelves that come from around the world.
And just to follow up to that, what can we do to further improve that understanding of trade between our countries? I know in the past, in the newspapers, pages have been taken out to express, the meaningful impact that our trade has had on U.S. cities. But is there more that we can do to raise that awareness within U.S. cities and towns?
Well, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is made up of about 3,000 state and local chambers, and for every major trade agreement that the United States has been a party to, we have activated that federation of state and local chambers to help tell that story. Often we have taken with us ambassadors from Washington for our trading partners to do whistle-stop tours to various states to get out and meet those folks in those communities where trade is happening. And certainly we are prepared to continue that in support of the CUSMA review.
for that. And as you know, the Prime Minister has announced our Team Canada-U.S. engagement strategy earlier this year, being led by Minister Ng and Minister François-Philippe Champagne, and of course Ambassador Hillman. And so part of my role is to go out to municipalities across Canada to see if we can bring in those stories and share them with our U.S. counterparts. And so I'm going to turn to Mr. Schaaf about, what are your conversations like in terms of with some of your counterparts down in the U.S., and where do you think the government should be focusing on our Team Canada-U.S. engagement strategy?
Yeah, sorry, it's Dennis Laycraft. It's a great question. We've, for many years, maintained a very active communication strategy in the United States. We go to many of the state meetings. We participate in what's called SARL, the State Agricultural Rural Leaders Meeting, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. There's one in the East. There's NASDA, the North American Departments of Agriculture.
Excuse me,
meeting.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. The bells are ringing. It's a 30-minute bell. Does the committee okay to continue on until we finish, till we get to 5:30? Okay, fine, thank you. You have a minute and 35 seconds remaining.
And as Mr. Chafe mentioned, we do have trilateral meetings 3 times a year where we work with our counterparts down there. So we have a great relationship with the state associations at the state level, which of course governors and all of this are very influential down there in U.S. So we consider our work down there almost as important as our work here. When you export almost half of our production to the United States, and there's been a really mutual beneficial relationship that has grown as a result of this. And it's one of these, it was mentioned earlier, the question, how much do people in the United States appreciate how important trade is? To be honest, that's a similar question we should ask in Canada. There's a lot more work we all need to do to really talk about how beneficial this North American agreement is for our industry. It's really a lifeblood for many of our producers to be able to maintain it and grow forward.
Yeah. I've got about 20 seconds left, but in terms of the states in the U.S., where would you think that the Canadian government should be focused on in relation to your industry?
The regulatory cooperation, we just went through a period with climate issues where, one year we were part of one year we were importing 7 unit trains of corn a week because we were short. Suddenly flipped, and in August we started sending unit trains of feed grain south because they were short. So there's a really mutual beneficial when we have these integrated supply chains. And I think the more we can talk about how important that is even to just food affordability in North America, and having that regular supply that we all take for granted, I think can reach the average person when you have that conversation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have very little time for exchanges today. I had the intention to come up with a motion. I won't do that today. I will use some of my time just to read this quickly, but I would hope in the next meeting we take time to discuss this. Whereas duty-free shop regulations under the Customs Act clearly state that goods in duty-free stores are for immediate export only and must be declared under the Act if returned to Canada, whereas duty-free stores are subject to strict location, inventory, declaration, and storage requirements to ensure that all products sold there are exported for consumption outside Canada, that the committee recommend that the government recognize duty-free as an export industry, that a clear indication of the nature of this industry be conveyed to all federal agencies concerned, and that it report back to the House before the end of the current session of Parliament. So I will move to the next theme. I would like to thank all our witnesses for being here. Mr. Heather, the American government's position during the renegotiation of the free trade agreement, there was a dispute settlement mechanism put in place, and we know the Trump administration worked hard to eliminate the so-called Chapter 11. As a Chamber of Commerce, is that your position also?
Si j'ai bien entendu la question, c'est quant à la... à l'opinion de la Chambre sur cette décision. Nous appuyons cela, mais nous n'étions pas pour le retrait de la chapitre 11 de la CE. Mais nous soutenons ce qui reste dans l'accord avec le Mexique.
So you disagreed with the American administration's position, then?
Unique that we disagree with our own government. It happens routinely. The position of the United States was largely driven out of the belief that the U.S. should not be investing abroad. And we believe that U.S. investment abroad is a good thing, just like we think foreign investment into the United States is a good thing. And so the politics for around that decision may be different in the United States than they are up here in Canada, but for those reasons, we opposed it.
Monsieur Barisha,
Mr. Barisha, I heard you earlier say you don't have the same position at all. You supported ending the Chapter 11 of NAFTA, but you said there is a small part that has to be taken out. Could you provide us some more information on that?
Oui, j'ai oublié mon micro.
Yes, I forgot my microphone, so the sound quality is not too good. I think it's still in Chapter 14. What previously was Chapter 11, which would apply to certain strategic sectors such as energy, telecommunications, amongst others. I forget the full list of all the sectors for which Chapter 14 still applies. So this means that Mexico, in its efforts to exercise some sovereignty on its energy sector, will potentially be subject to lawsuits by American investors. So in the long run, you're saying if there was a disagreement concerning a state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism to make sure that everyone is at this same level field, if there is an issue to be settled, they have to go through their countries and that everything will be settled nation to nation. Thank you. Is it Ms. Zelik? You are a professor in environmental studies. If I understood your word, the climate agency will try to apply more regulations to protect the environment. Does CUSMA allow? Yeah.
Is she back online now?
Ah, elle est plus là? Okay.
She's having technical.
She's no longer there.
I've returned now.
Okay.
Avez-vous pu comprendre la question?
Did you understand the question? It was going fast. I didn't hear the question because
Connect due to a problem. I'm sorry, so I missed the question.
M'accordez-vous
Would you grant me the possibility of asking the question again?
For Mr. Cannings, maybe you could communicate to the witness and she can respond to you in writing.
En fait, est-ce que je peux juste lui demander de nous remettre ça par écrit, de nous remettre une réponse par
Can I just ask her to provide a written response?
Away from Mr.
Vous êtes professeur en environnement, l'urgence climatique.
Environmental studies, the climate change requires you to use more regulations. Does CUSMA allow nations in a sovereign manner to apply the necessary environmental measures? Do you have any worries or concerns about that?
Possibly respond to that question to the clerk. It would be helpful, right? Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings, 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you.
If
Thank
that's
you.
okay with the committee, Mr. Cannings, I realize the clock says 5:30, but Mr. Canning is the last, and he wants his 5 minutes, so please go ahead.
I do. Well, thank you. I'll try to be quick then. I'll stay with Professor Zelik. You talked about the labor chapter in CUSMA, the rapid response provisions. You mentioned that you'd like to see them expanded to include agriculture, labor. I'm just wondering if you could expand on how you think that rapid response section has performed in CUSMA, and besides the agricultural aspect, how you think it could be strengthened and whether we've been enforcing it properly.
Thank you very much. So I just saw a series of presentations from Mexican specialists on the rapid response mechanism. And in general, while people feel that it's been helpful in the broader process of labor reform in Mexico, there's a general feeling, of course, that there's an unequal application of this to the United States and Canada, where a similar mechanism should be in place that would not require federal approval for complaints about violations of labor rights and the ability to collectively organize, to go directly to the rapid response mechanism rather than requiring approval from Canadian or US authorities. So that was one point that was raised, and that would be significant, of course, if by expanding the priority sectors to agriculture, this would also allow, ideally, for the questions of migrant labor and the protections of migrant labor within Canada to be considered under CUSMA. One of the other sectors that has been raised, in fact, is also the energy sector. And so with relation, for instance, to the question that was asked previously, it's notable that under the Mexican energy reform, one of the outcomes was the denationalization of the sector, which has led to a series of subcontractors to Pemex, some of which are US and Canadian firms that are not easily governable. So there is the concern that there needs to be a means of applying the rapid response mechanism to subcontractors in a range of different sectors. So that's also an area of concern. And finally, if I can, if I may, with relation to the earlier question, I think the broader concern is that there is still state-to-state dispute, and where with relation to other concerns that have been raised, trade is prioritized over social concerns and environmental concerns that affect all residents of the continent, and thus there is the need to have enforceable legislation that is not subject to cancellation under preferential clauses in the agreement that put an emphasis on the concerns of private firms over the need to enforce, for instance, commitments under the Paris Agreement and so on. Thank you very much.
Okay, 1 minute. I'll just then turn to Mr. Barry Shaw and ask more or less the same question about those, the labor chapter and rapid response effectiveness up to now, what you would change on what Professor Zalek mentioned.
From what we've seen with the rapid response mechanism, it has been effective in a number of cases where independent unions have been in recognition fights, basically with unions that are very much kind of yellow unions, as they're called, unions that are kind of corrupt and not really representative of the workers. And I think this is often the case in sectors like the automotive industry, where these kind of recognition fights have been going on. And so I think that's really important for the trade agreement to support labor rights rather than help drive them down. And from what I've heard from unions doing this kind of cross-border work with those Mexican auto workers, it's been a help and it's been effective. And I would be delighted to see it expanded to other sectors of the economy.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses for your patience today and for your very valuable information. I will move adjournment of the meeting.